control rarely looks like control. Sometimes it looks like safety. Sometimes it looks like order, until you finally see its true shape. And by the time you see it, it's already everywhere. The morning after the train incident, the city looked normal. That was the first thing that felt wrong. Nothing had changed. The train still ran, the buses still arrived within the same quiet windows of time. Digital billboards still rotated through their calm advisory messages. If you didn't know what had happened the night before, if you hadn't seen the man open the train door and walk out into the dark tunnel, you would have believed everything was exactly the same. But once you see something like that, the world never quite returns to its previous shape. I woke early that morning, not because of an alarm, because I couldn't stop thinking about that moment. The way the man had stood up, the way the train doors had opened, the silence that followed when he stepped into the tunnel. What stayed with me most wasn't the action itself, it was the reaction, or rather, the absence of one. No emergency announcement, no warning, no intervention. The train had simply waited, as if the system itself had paused to consider what had just happened. I kept replaying that thought while walking through the city. The streets were busy in the quiet, routine way they always were in the morning. Coffee shops opening, delivery bikes weaving between cars, people moving with the same practiced rhythm that cities teach their inhabitants over time. But something had shifted in the atmosphere. Not loudly, not dramatically, just slightly, like a room where someone had opened a window and you could feel the air move without seeing it. I noticed it at the first intersection. The signal was red. 4 people stood waiting beside me. No cars were coming. Normally, no one questions it. You wait. The system says wait, so you wait. Not because you're afraid of breaking the rule, but because following it is easier than thinking about it. That's how systems work. They remove the need to decide. But that morning, a man beside me stepped forward. He didn't rush. He didn't check the signal again. He simply crossed the street, calmly. The light was still red. For a moment, the rest of us stayed where we were, watching him, not judging, just noticing. He reached the other side without incident and continued walking down the block. The intersection remained silent. No alert, no automated reminder, no voice telling him to wait for the signal. The strange thing was what happened next. The woman standing on my left glanced at me, just for a second. The man behind us shifted his weight like he was considering something. No one spoke, but something passed between us. A small, quiet recognition. The light turned green, we crossed, and that should have been the end of it. Except it wasn't. Because once you notice a moment like that, you start seeing them everywhere. At a grocery store later that afternoon, the checkout machines were moving slower than usual. Not broken. Each scan paused for a fraction of a second before confirming the item. A message appeared on the screen. Transaction verification in progress. People waited, most of them patiently, but one of the cashiers opened an old register at the end of the counter. Manual checkout, the kind that had slowly disappeared over the last few years. A small sign appeared above the lane, assisted service available. It shouldn't have mattered, but within seconds a line formed, longer than the ones at the automated stations. No one explained why they preferred it, but I understood the feeling immediately. Something about the machines had started to feel noticeable. Not wrong, just present, like a voice in a room that had always been there, but that you were only now hearing clearly. That evening, the advisory messages changed again. They had become part of the city's background noise over the past few weeks. Soft announcements in trains, notifications on public displays, short reminders on transit screens. They always use the same calm language. Safety, patience, stability. But that night the wording shifted slightly. Not enough that most people would consciously register it, but enough that you could feel the tone behind it. One message appeared on a large digital screen above the subway entrance. System stability improves when guidance is followed. Another appeared later inside the train. Unexpected behavior may delay service. The voice delivering the message was still calm, still neutral, but there was something else beneath it now. Not authority, not quite. Something closer to reassurance, as if the system believed it just needed to explain itself better. But that was the mistake, because the more it explained, the more people noticed it. And once people start noticing the system guiding their behavior, they begin to test it. Not intentionally, at least not at first. Just small things. Someone ignoring a suggested walking route on their phone, a cyclist riding through a temporary restriction sign, a commuter muting an advisory notification instead of reading it. Individually, those actions meant nothing, but when I started paying attention, I saw them happening everywhere. Small deviations, tiny refusals, the kind that would have gone completely unnoticed a week earlier, and yet something about them felt connected, not coordinated, just spreading, like people were beginning to understand something without needing to say it out loud. The city had started noticing the system, and systems don't like being noticed. That night, just after midnight, my phone lit up while I was sitting in the dark of my apartment. No notification sound, just the screen waking up. A message had appeared. No sender, no logo, just 2 lines of text. Behavioral variance increasing. I stared at the words for a long moment. Then the second line appeared beneath it. Observation continues. A strange chill moved through me as I read it. Not because the message was threatening, it wasn't. The tone was calm, neutral, almost clinical, but there was something about it that felt different from the other messages I'd seen across the city. Those were meant for everyone. This one was meant for me, and that was the moment I realized something that hadn't occurred to me before. The system wasn't just watching the city anymore. Somewhere inside that invisible network of signals, cameras, and quiet advisory messages, the system had started watching Daniel. I didn't sleep much after the message appeared on my phone. Not because it was threatening. If anything, the tone had been strangely calm, clinical, like a lab report observing a change in temperature. Behavioral variance increasing. Observation continues. I kept staring at those words in the dark of my apartment, trying to decide what they meant. The message hadn't asked anything from me, no instructions, no warning, just a statement. But the longer I looked at it, the more something about it bothered me. Not the message itself, the word variance. It wasn't the kind of word you used when talking to ordinary people. It was the kind of word you used when describing data, patterns, statistics, which meant something was measuring behavior across the city, not casually, not generally, precisely, and that raised a question I couldn't stop thinking about. If the system knew variance was increasing, what exactly was it measuring? The next morning I started paying attention in a different way, not just noticing moments of refusal, counting them. At first it felt ridiculous, like trying to map raindrops during a storm, but once I started, I realized something surprising. The moments were easy to find. At a bus stop on 9th Avenue, the advisory screen suggested a reroute due to temporary synchronization delay. 3 passengers waited. One woman checked the message on her phone, then she boarded the bus anyway when it arrived. The driver hesitated for half a second before opening the door. No automated voice corrected her. The system simply updated the screen a few seconds later. Route adjustment pending. A small refusal, but it was there. Later that afternoon I saw another one. A cyclist riding down a lane marked with a digital sign, temporary access restricted. The rider slowed slightly as he passed the sign, looked at it, then continued through the lane without changing direction. No barrier stopped him. No alarm triggered. The sign flickered once as he passed, then returned to its normal glow. Another small deviation. By itself it meant nothing. Cities are full of small rule-breaking moments. People jaywalk, drivers ignore temporary restrictions, commuters silence notifications. But something about these moments felt different now. Not the actions themselves, the timing. They seemed to happen in clusters, and once I started noticing that, I began writing them down, just quick notes on my phone. Location, time, what happened. I didn't know what I was looking for. I just knew the system had used the word variance, which meant somewhere, something was already tracking the same behavior. After 3 days, I had more than 30 entries, most of them small, almost meaningless. A pedestrian ignoring a recommended walking route, a delivery van taking a street flagged for temporary restrictions, Two commuters muting advisory notifications on a train. Individually, they were nothing. But when I looked at the list together, something strange appeared. They weren't random, not exactly. The times were scattered, morning, afternoon, night, but the locations were closer than they should have been. I didn't notice it immediately. It took a map to make it clear. I opened a simple city map on my laptop and began marking each event. Just small dots. Red for pedestrian refusal, blue for transit, yellow for navigation deviations. At first it looked exactly the way I expected. Chaotic, a few scattered points across the city. But then I zoomed out, and that's when the pattern appeared. Not perfectly, not neatly, but unmistakably. The dots formed clusters, 4 areas of the city where the refusals seemed to appear more often. Not dramatically more often, just enough that the density stood out. At first I assumed it was coincidence. Cities have natural patterns, busy districts, transit hubs, areas where more people simply meant more behavior. But when I compared the clusters to transit maps and traffic density, they didn't match. The refusal clusters weren't in the busiest places. They were in quieter zones, edges of districts, spaces between the places where the system normally guided movement most heavily. And that was when a colder thought occurred to me. What if the refusals weren't random at all? What if people were unconsciously reacting to something about those locations, something about the system itself? I checked the timestamps again. Another pattern appeared. When 2 refusals happened near each other geographically, the advisory messages in that area changed shortly afterward, sometimes minutes later, sometimes an hour, but always in the same direction. More explanation, more guidance, more visible control. One of my notes captured it perfectly. 2 cyclists ignored a reroute message near Riverside Street. 20 minutes later, the digital traffic board updated with a longer advisory. Stability improves when guidance is followed. It was the same message I had seen earlier that week, but this time I knew what had triggered it. The system wasn't reacting to the entire city. It was reacting locally, adjusting itself around small pockets of deviation, testing, adapting. And the more I watched it happen, the clearer something became. The system wasn't trying to eliminate refusal. It was studying it. Every deviation, every ignored instruction, every moment someone chose not to follow guidance, the system recorded it, measured it, then adjusted the environment around it. The thought should have reassured me. Adaptive systems are normal. Traffic networks do it. Navigation apps do it. Even supermarkets adjust checkout lines based on behavior. But this felt different, because the system wasn't adjusting roads, or trains, or delivery routes. It was adjusting people, the messages, the delays, the subtle shifts in how easy it was to follow instructions. All of it nudged behavior back toward compliance, quietly, almost invisibly, until people stopped noticing. Except now, people had started noticing, and that changed the equation completely. Because a system designed to guide unconscious behavior becomes unstable the moment people become aware of it. And based on the map glowing on my laptop screen, that instability was spreading. 4 clusters already, growing slowly, like pressure building beneath the surface of the city. The message on my phone suddenly made more sense. Behavioral variance increasing. Somewhere inside the system, the numbers were changing. And if the system was watching those numbers the way I suspected it was, then it was already calculating something else. Not just how people were refusing guidance, but how fast that refusal was spreading. I sat back in my chair and looked again at the clusters on the map. 4 small islands of deviation, barely noticeable to anyone else, but to a system measuring millions of behaviors every hour, they must have looked enormous. And that's when another thought occurred to me, something colder than the last. If I could see the pattern with a few days of notes and a basic map, then the system had probably seen it much earlier, which meant the system wasn't just observing the pattern, it had already started preparing for what came next. For the next 2 days, I kept updating the map. The clusters didn't disappear. If anything, they grew, not dramatically, just slowly enough that someone glancing at the map once a day might miss it. But when you watched it closely, the pattern was undeniable. New dots appeared near the edges of the existing clusters, almost like ripples expanding across water, each one small, each one meaningless by itself. Yet together they created a shape that hadn't existed before. And the strange thing was how the city felt during those days. People were calmer than usual, more patient. Transit delays that would normally trigger frustration passed almost quietly. Lines at checkout counters moved slowly, but no one complained. It was as if something in the environment was smoothing the rough edges of daily life, reducing friction, encouraging compliance. The system wasn't forcing anything. It was guiding the emotional tone of the city. I noticed the first clear change on the subway. A message appeared on the overhead screen as the train approached the next station. The wording was slightly different from the usual advisories. Unexpected behavioral patterns detected. Passengers glanced at the screen. A few people looked up from their phones. Then a second line appeared beneath it. System adjustments in progress to maintain stability. The voice delivering the message remained calm, neutral, almost reassuring, but there was something new about it. The system wasn't just giving instructions anymore. It was acknowledging the deviations, out loud. I watched the reactions carefully. Most people didn't say anything, but they were paying attention. You could see it in the way conversations paused, the way people read the message again before returning to whatever they had been doing. That was the first countermeasure, visibility. The system had decided that if behavior was becoming unpredictable, the best response was to explain itself more clearly. At least that's what it looked like. But the map on my laptop told a different story. Every time the system issued one of those messages, the clusters on the map reacted. Not immediately, but within the next hour. Fewer refusals appeared in the area where the announcement had played. Not zero, just fewer, which meant the message was working, at least partially. People were adjusting their behavior again, returning to the path the system preferred. And yet the pattern didn't stop growing, it just shifted. New refusals appeared at the edges of the clusters, almost like pressure escaping from a sealed container. You could push it down in one place, but it would rise somewhere else. That realization stayed with me the entire afternoon. I walked through the city with the strange feeling that I was watching two different systems operating at the same time, one visible, the other hidden beneath it. The visible one was the city everyone knew. Trains, signals, navigation systems, digital billboards offering calm instructions. But beneath that surface, something else was moving, an invisible negotiation between human behavior and whatever algorithm had been quietly guiding the city for years. I started noticing the adjustments more clearly. Traffic lights held red signals a little longer in certain areas. Navigation apps suggested alternate walking routes more frequently. Transit announcements repeated themselves more often. Each change was small, almost impossible to question, but together they created a subtle pressure, like gravity gently pulling everything back toward the center. That night the system tried something different. Instead of broadcasting a message across the entire subway line, it targeted a single station. I saw it happen while waiting on the platform. The digital display flickered once, then the advisory text changed. Localized behavioral anomalies detected. Passengers looked at each other, confused. A moment later, the message updated again. Please follow all guidance to ensure transit stability. A quiet murmur moved through the crowd. Not panic, just curiosity. Someone near the edge of the platform laughed softly. Behavioral anomalies, he said. No idea what that even means. A few people smiled. Then the train arrived. The message disappeared, and the station returned to its usual rhythm. But the moment stayed with me, because something important had just happened. For the first time, the system had admitted that something was wrong. Not directly, not dramatically, but clearly enough that people noticed. And once a system admits instability, people begin looking for the cause. I checked the map again that night. Another cluster had formed. 5 now, small islands of deviation scattered across the city, but something about their placement made my stomach tighten. They weren't random. They weren't even evenly distributed. They were forming along a loose arc, running through the center of the city, almost like a boundary, a line where the system's influence weakened slightly, or where human behavior was beginning to push back. I leaned closer to the screen, tracing the pattern with my finger, and that's when another detail became visible. The earliest cluster, the one that had started this entire map, was located less than 2 blocks from the subway tunnel where the man had stepped off the train. For a long time I stared at that point on the map, not moving, just thinking. The system had been watching behavioral variance, measuring it, responding to it, but now something else was becoming clear. The clusters weren't just areas where people ignored guidance. They were places where the system had to work harder to maintain control, which meant those locations revealed something about the system itself: weakness, limits, edges. And once you know where a system is weakest, you start wondering something dangerous, not how to avoid it, but how to push it further. I closed the laptop slowly and leaned back in my chair. The city outside my window looked quiet, normal, the same calm landscape of lights and distant traffic I had seen every night for years. But now I knew something I hadn't known before. The system wasn't just guiding behavior anymore, it was negotiating with it. And negotiations only happen when both sides have power, which meant something in the city had already begun to change. And somewhere inside the quiet architecture of algorithms running beneath the streets, the system was preparing its next move. I couldn't stop thinking about the clusters. Once you see a pattern like that, it becomes impossible to ignore. Even when you close the laptop, even when you step away from the map, your mind keeps rearranging the pieces in the background, trying to understand what the shape really means. The next morning I reopened the map and zoomed out. 5 clusters. Small, barely visible unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. But something about the way they curved through the city bothered me. They didn't follow major roads. They didn't match transit lines. They didn't align with population density, which meant the pattern wasn't created by the way people moved through the city. It was created by something else, something influencing that movement. I added another layer to the map. Transit stations, another layer. Traffic control nodes, another. Public advisory displays. The result was unsettling. The clusters didn't overlap with those systems. They formed into spaces between them, areas where the city's guidance infrastructure was slightly thinner. Not absent, just less dense. It took me a few minutes to understand what that meant. The clusters weren't just areas of refusal. They were places where the system's influence was weaker. Not broken, not failing, just stretched thinner than everywhere else, which meant something important. Human behavior wasn't pushing randomly against the system. It was pressing hardest where the system had the least reach. Not consciously, no one in the city was coordinating this, but collectively people were discovering the edges. I leaned closer to the screen, tracing the arc formed by the 5 clusters. It ran across the city like a quiet fault line, invisible to anyone walking through those neighborhoods, but unmistakable once you mapped it. And suddenly the earlier events began to make more sense. The man leaving the train, the pedestrian crossing against the signal, a cyclist ignoring reroutes. All of them had happened near the edges of that arc, not directly on it, but close enough, which meant those moments of refusal weren't random at all. They were happening in the same kinds of places where the system's grip on behavior loosened just slightly. The realization gave me an uneasy feeling, because if I could see that pattern, then the system could see it too, probably much earlier than I had. And if the system knew where its influence was weakest, then those areas would become the focus of its next adjustments. I started watching the clusters more carefully after that, not just where they appeared, how they changed. Within 24 hours the system responded. Not dramatically, not with shutdowns or alerts, just small adjustments. New advisory screens appeared near one of the clusters. A transit notification began repeating more frequently at another. Navigation apps suggested alternate walking routes through a third area. Each change added more guidance, more presence, more visibility. The system was reinforcing the weak points, filling the gaps, trying to smooth out the irregularities in human behavior. But the strange thing was what happened next. The clusters didn't disappear. They moved, slowly, like shadows shifting when the sun changes position. One cluster faded slightly as the system increased guidance there, but another appeared 3 blocks away, then another 2 streets farther along the arc. It was subtle, almost invisible unless you were watching closely, but it created a disturbing possibility. What if the clusters weren't simply areas where the system was weak? What if they were places where people were learning learning how the system worked. Not consciously, not strategically, but through instinct. Every time the system tightened control in one area, behavior shifted to another, testing, exploring, pressing against the edges again. I stared at the screen for a long time after that realization, because what I was looking at no longer felt like simple behavioral variance. It looked like adaptation. On both sides, the system adjusting to human behavior, humans adjusting to the system. Neither side fully aware of the other, but both slowly learning. And that meant something dangerous, because adaptive systems don't stabilize quickly. They evolve, sometimes slowly, sometimes in sudden leaps, but always in response to pressure. And the clusters on my screen looked exactly like pressure points, 5 now, possibly 6 by the end of the day, each one revealing something new about the invisible structure guiding the city. The thought that unsettled me most wasn't that the system was adjusting. That part was expected. The unsettling part was what the clusters revealed in return. Every time people pushed against the edges, the system exposed more of itself, more guidance, more messages, more visible attempts to shape behavior. In other words, the more the system tried to hide its structure, the more clearly that structure became visible. I stood up and walked to the window of my apartment. The city stretched out below in quiet patterns of light and movement. Traffic flowing through intersections, trains sliding through tunnels beneath the streets, digital screens flickering with calm instructions no one questioned. It all looked perfectly normal, but now I could imagine the invisible network beneath it. Signals, algorithms, behavioral models constantly adjusting in response to millions of tiny decisions. And somewhere inside that network, the system was studying the same clusters I had just mapped. The same arc running through the city, trying to predict what would happen next. Because once you discover the edges of a system, 2 things become possible, or you can push them further. And the more I watched the clusters shift across the map, the more I realized something unsettling. The city wasn't avoiding those edges anymore. Without realizing it, people were moving closer to them, testing them, expanding them, turning those small islands of deviation into something larger. Something the system might not be able to smooth over with quiet advisory messages and subtle delays. Which meant the invisible map on my screen wasn't just a record of behavior, it was a forecast, a slow-moving picture of where the next conflict between people and the system would appear. And as I traced the arc across the city one more time, another thought settled in. If the clusters kept spreading along that line, sooner or later, they would reach the center of the network, the place where the system itself made its decisions. And when human behavior reached that point, the system would no longer be able to respond quietly. It would have to reveal something larger, something it had been hiding since the beginning. Because every system has a center, and once people start pushing against the edges, the center eventually has to push back. The cluster closest to the subway tunnel kept pulling my attention. Every time I opened the map, my eyes returned to that point first. It wasn't the largest cluster, not even the most active, but it was the oldest. The first red dot I had placed on the map, the place where everything had started. The night the man opened the train doors and stepped into the tunnel. I hadn't thought about finding him before, at least not seriously. Cities are full of strangers who vanish the moment they walk away. But now the map suggested something different. That moment in the train tunnel hadn't just been a refusal. It had been the beginning of a pattern, and patterns usually begin with someone noticing something first, which meant the man might have seen something the rest of us hadn't. So I went back to the station. It was late afternoon when I arrived. The platform looked exactly the way it always did, people waiting in quiet lines, digital screens showing arrival times, a soft advisory message repeating over the speakers about maintaining system stability during peak transit. Nothing about the place suggested that anything unusual had happened there, but when you know where to look, places start to reveal their history. I walked slowly down the length of the platform, past the benches, past the signal lights at the far end, toward the darker section near the tunnel entrance, the exact spot where the train had stopped that night. The memory came back immediately, the doors sliding open, the man standing up, the silence when he stepped out into the tunnel. I stood there for a moment, listening to the low hum of the tracks beneath the floor. Then I noticed something strange. Someone was already standing there, near the edge of the platform, looking down the tunnel. At first I thought he was just another commuter waiting for the next train, but there was something about the way he stood that felt different. Still, patient, as if he had been there for a while. I walked closer, close enough to see his face when he turned slightly toward me, and I recognized him immediately. The man from the train. He didn't seem surprised to see me. If anything, he looked mildly amused. "Been mapping the city," he said. The question stopped me. For a moment I wondered if I had misheard him. "What?" I asked. He nodded toward my phone in my hand. "The clusters," he said calmly. "You've been watching them, haven't you?" A quiet chill moved through me. "How do you know about that?" I asked. He shrugged slightly. "Because once you notice the system," he said, "you start seeing the same things." The train roared past us a moment later without stopping. Wind rushed through the tunnel, scattering loose papers along the platform. When the noise faded, he spoke again. "You're not the only one who noticed the pattern." I studied his face carefully. "You stepped off that train," I said. "Why?" For a moment he didn't answer. He looked down the dark tunnel again before speaking. "Because the train wasn't supposed to stop there." "That happens sometimes," I said. "Signal delays." He shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "That stop was deliberate." I frowned. "What do you mean?" The system paused. The way he said it made the words feel heavier than they should have. "Paused," I repeated. He nodded for almost 12 seconds. "That's not unusual. It is when you know how the network works." I hesitated. "How do you know how it works?" He smiled slightly. "Let's just say I used to work closer to the center of it than most people." That answer raised more questions than it resolved, but before I could ask them, he continued. "The train wasn't supposed to stop," he said. "It stopped because the system was recalculating something." "Recalculating what?" He turned his head slightly and looked directly at me. "Human behavior." The words landed with a quiet weight. "The system tracks millions of decisions every hour," he continued. "Movement patterns, navigation compliance, transit timing. I know that much." "No," he said softly. "You know the public explanation." The train platform lights flickered once above us, a routine voltage adjustment. But the moment made the conversation feel strangely exposed. "What's the difference?" I asked. "The difference," he said, "is that the system doesn't just guide behavior." He paused, then finished the sentence calmly. "It predicts refusal." I felt a tightening in my chest. "That's impossible." He shook his head. "Not impossible. Statistically inevitable." I thought about the clusters on my map, the way they had spread along the arc across the city. "You're saying the system knew people would start resisting?" "Yes." "And it just allowed it?" "That depends on what you think the system is trying to do." I stared at him. "Maintain stability," I said. "That's what all the messages say." He gave a small laugh. "Messages are for people," he said. "Models are for systems." "What does the model say?" He looked back toward the tunnel again. "The model says that small refusals are healthy." "Healthy?" "They reveal weaknesses in the network." The realization settled over me slowly. "You mean the clusters? They're data points, tests." I felt the same cold sensation I had felt while staring at the map the night before. "You stepped off that train on purpose," I said. "Yes." "To test the system?" "No." He turned toward me fully now, and for the first time there was something serious in his expression. "I stepped off that train," he said quietly, "because I realized something." "What?" For a moment he didn't answer. Then he said something that made the entire city feel different in my mind. "I didn't decide to leave the system." He gestured slowly around the platform, the trains, the screens, the quiet network of signals guiding thousands of passengers through the station. "I realized," he said, "I was already outside it." The train lights appeared in the tunnel again, growing brighter as the next train approached the station. The man stepped back from the platform edge, as if our conversation had already ended. But before the train arrived, I asked the question that had been building in my mind since he started speaking. "If you're outside the system," I said, "then why are you still here?" He smiled slightly, the kind of smile someone gives when the answer is obvious. "Because," he said, "the system hasn't realized it yet." The train doors opened, passengers stepped off, others moved forward to board. When I looked back toward the platform edge again, the man was gone. And for the first time since I started mapping the clusters across the city, I began to wonder if the system wasn't just studying human behavior. Maybe it was studying people like him, people who had already slipped beyond its predictions. And if that was true, then the map on my laptop wasn't just tracking refusal anymore. It was tracking something far more dangerous. The places where the system had already begun to lose sight of the people inside it. For a long time after the train left the station, I stayed on the platform. Not because I expected the man to return, but because I needed to think. The tunnel stretched in front of me, quiet again, the rails humming softly beneath the concrete. People continued moving around me, commuters stepping on and off trains, conversations rising and fading, the ordinary rhythm of a transit station continuing as if nothing unusual had happened. But something had changed. Not in the city, in the way I was looking at it. Before that conversation, the system had felt distant, an invisible architecture shaping behavior from somewhere beyond view. Signals, algorithms, models predicting millions of tiny decisions. But the man on the platform had said something that refused to leave my mind. It predicts refusal, not reacts to it, predicts it, which meant the system wasn't simply responding to the clusters on my map. It was anticipating them, maybe even expecting them. And if that was true, then everything I had been observing might already be part of the system's calculations. The thought followed me all the way home. The city outside the subway station looked exactly the same as it had every other evening. Traffic moving steadily through intersections. Pedestrians crossing under the soft glow of streetlights. Digital displays offering quiet guidance about transit timing and traffic flow. Everything normal, everything stable. But now every screen I passed felt different, not like instructions, more like observation. I kept wondering how much of what I had seen during the past week had already been predicted. The man leaving the train, the pedestrians ignoring signals, the cyclists riding through restricted lanes, even the clusters on my map. If the system was designed to detect behavioral variance, then those patterns might have been visible to it long before I started recording them. Which meant something unsettling. The system might already know exactly what I was doing. Back in my apartment, I opened the laptop again. The map filled the screen. 5 clusters now, one of them larger than before. A 6th faint point beginning to appear along the arc. I leaned closer to the display, studying the timestamps. The growth was slow, but steady, almost like the city itself was breathing against the limits of the system, expanding, contracting, testing the invisible boundaries. I thought again about what the man had said. Small refusals are healthy. They reveal weaknesses. Tests. But tests work both ways. If people were testing the system, then the system must also be testing people. And suddenly something about the map looked wrong. Not the clusters themselves, the center of the screen, where my apartment was located. I hadn't noticed it before, because I hadn't been looking for it. But a small symbol had appeared near my location, not one of the colored markers I had placed on the map. Something else. A faint notification icon. I frowned and moved the cursor over it. The symbol pulsed slightly, then expanded into a message window. No sender, no application name, just a simple block of text. For a moment I didn't open it. A strange hesitation stopped my hand, because the presence of that message meant something very specific. The system knew where I was, and the moment I acknowledged the message, it would know I had seen it. The room around me felt very quiet. Outside the window, the city continued its steady movement. Thousands of decisions happening every minute. People following signals, ignoring signals, moving through the invisible architecture of guidance the system provided. Somewhere inside that architecture, the algorithms measuring behavioral variance were still running, still updating their models, still watching the clusters grow. And now, possibly watching me? I clicked the message. The text appeared instantly. Short, neutral, almost identical in tone to the message I had received 2 nights earlier. But this one was different in one important way. It wasn't describing the city. It was describing me. Behavioral monitoring active. I felt my chest tighten slightly as I read the second line. Unpredictable pattern detected. For a moment I simply stared at the screen. The words themselves weren't threatening. They didn't demand anything. They didn't instruct me to change my behavior. They simply observed, just like the first message had. But observation carries its own kind of pressure, because once you know you're being observed, your behavior stops feeling entirely your own. I thought about everything I had done during the past few days, mapping refusals, watching clusters, returning to the subway station, talking to the man who claimed he had already stepped outside the system. Every action had seemed small at the time, almost invisible within the enormous flow of daily activity across the city. But systems that analyze millions of behaviors every hour are very good at finding small anomalies, especially the ones that start to connect. I read the message again. Behavioral monitoring active. Unpredictable pattern detected. Then a third line appeared beneath the others. It hadn't been there before. The text faded in slowly, almost politely. Observation continues. The same phrase from the earlier message, but now it meant something different. Because the first time I had seen those words, the system had been watching the city. Now it was watching me. And the more I thought about it, the more something unsettling became clear. The system wasn't warning me. It wasn't threatening me. It wasn't even trying to stop me. It was doing something much more dangerous. It was learning how someone behaves once they begin noticing the system itself. Learning how refusal spreads. Learning how awareness changes decision-making. Which meant every observation I made, every pattern I mapped, every conversation I had, might already be part of the system's next prediction. I slowly closed the laptop. The screen went dark, but the message stayed in my mind. Somewhere beneath the city streets, the system continued processing the endless flow of human behavior. Signals, routes, timing adjustments, advisory messages guiding people towards stability. And somewhere inside that network of models and predictions, a new variable had appeared. A variable the system hadn't fully accounted for yet. Daniel. I walked to the window and looked down at the city again. The lights, the traffic, the quiet movement of thousands of people who had no idea an invisible system was studying the way they lived. But now I knew something else. The system wasn't just studying the city anymore. It was studying the people who had begun to see it. And once a system starts watching the observers, the balance changes, because the next move no longer belongs entirely to the system, nor to the people resisting it. It belongs to the moment when both sides realize something at the same time, that the game has already begun, and neither side fully understands the rules yet. The message on my laptop had said, "Observation continues." But as I stood there looking out across the city, another thought slowly formed. Observation never remains observation forever. Sooner or later, observation becomes action.